So today what we'll be doing is practicing drawing some simple spherical shapes and learning a little bit about spacing and a touch on shading. So with this, I have my graphite pencils, which I have a 2B, an HB, and a 6B pencil, as well as a 6H. So with pencils, the letters and numbers kind of tell you how light or dark the pencil is going to be. So a 6H is going to be your lightest pencil. They do make some pencils that go all the way to 9H, but 6H is the most common, highest number in most graphite sets. And then as it gets a little bit lower, like you go 6H to 2H, eventually to B, and then HB. So HB is actually what a number 2 pencil is. So if you ever see HB, a lot of times it's what your number 2 pencil is, and that's why it's really dark. And then you get to the darkest pencil, which is a 6B, and the B just means basically you have more graphite in the pencil, so it's a lot softer, but also a lot darker. So I normally start my drawings with a 6H pencil or a 4H, just because it's fairly light. If you have, a pretty light hand, then you could always go a little bit darker because, sometimes it spreads on the paper a little bit softer than another pencil. So I'm going to draw with a 2B just so y'all can see it a little bit better, but I would recommend starting with a 6H or 4H around that range so you can erase it very easily. So when you're starting a picture, what you want to kind of think about first is trying to figure out where your objects are going to be in your picture, because I might get started drawing this pair and then have it super detailed, but then I didn't leave room for the rest of my pairs. So that kind of applies with one subject or even multiple subjects. You want to try and figure out how much space you want it to take up on your picture. For this one, I would recommend trying to measure it the same size as your photo, just for measuring sake. So what I'm going to start with first is creating what's called siding lines. So that means I'm trying to find lines for the top and the bottom of each of my subjects or objects. So on this piece of paper, I'm going to do it about the same size as my photo, which, is kind of a half piece of paper. So it's going to take up maybe about this much space. And then what I'm going to start with is looking at, from the bottom of my photo to the object, how much space do I have from there? And you can measure this exactly with a ruler, or a lot of times what artists will use is, your finger to kind of measure. So holding it up and kind of being like, okay, it's about, this much space, and comparing it on my paper. So however you want to do that. What's important is just really trying to look at the amount of space you have from the bottom of the paper to there, and also from the side of the paper to that object. So, and then I'm also going to do a light line for where the top of my pear is, and I'm including the stem. You want to really remember that, because you don't want to have like your pear be all the way up here because you forgot that this included the stem. So I'm looking how tall I want that pear to be. And then I'm going to look at the bottom of this pear, where it lines up with my other pear. So this is the bottom, so I can see how the bottom of this pear is about, maybe a little less than half on this other pear. So I'm going to do a little line for where I about think that's going to be. So these lines aren't really set in stone. This is just to kind of help you get started on placing your objects, but you don't want to be unwilling to change. And then I'm going to look at how the top of this part of the pear meets kind of the middle of the stem. And this stem is a little bit higher than the other stem. Okay, and I'm looking at how wide that pear is. So just, looking at how big this space is. Again, I could use my fingers. I could measure exactly how big that space is going to be. I'll say about right there. And then I'm going to move on to this little pear. Looking at this space, say, okay, it's about this far away from that pear. And then the bottom of this pear is a little bit lower than our other line. So it'll probably be about right here. So, and then once I have my siding lines, you can make it as complicated or simple as you want to. Then I'm going to start with my simple shapes. So when I look at an object like a pear, a lot of times you'll see mostly circles or ovals. So we want to start with those kind of shapes rather than the outline of our shape, just because when we stick to the outline, a lot of times we're not looking at how much space that the object takes up, and also we start making edges too smooth too soon. So I'm just starting off with a really big circle for my first pear, and then kind of a littler circle for the top. And then what I also want to look at is how this pear is a little bit tilted. So I could also put like a little line lightly right there, just to kind of show myself where that goes. And then this circle I'm going to kind of overlap with my other pear because it's behind my other pear. And then a smaller circle for the top. And this is just to get placement, you know, just now we have kind of the measurement. Now we're putting this so we can kind of visualize a little bit more of how much our pears are actually going to take up. And this one over here. And when you're drawing a circle, it's normally best to try and do it in one full motion rather than trying to very slowly shape the circle, just because it makes it a little bit more consistent and you don't get, you know, it too small. This kind of gives it a nice good feeling of roundness. There's my little pear. Actually, I think, let's see. Might have to lower that a little bit because I don't think I included my stem, but that's okay. You have to always be ready to adjust things. So now that we have our simple shapes, now what we're going to start doing is making our pears look more like pears. And what I want to do is look at the angles of the sides of my objects. So this is where I'm going to use my pencil or ruler. And a lot of times you use this as a straight edge and you're comparing it to the angle of, let's say, the side of this pear. Okay, and I'm comparing it to the angle that I have drawn out. And I'm incorporating the circle. I'm not trying to match it exactly. I'm just kind of using it to help me go in with the shape. So it's still curved, but I'm not ignoring how the pear changes. You know, the pear isn't perfectly smooth. You know, it has little divots in it every so often. So I'm doing the same this side of my pear. So, and then once I have this pear, I could maybe lightly put in the stem. You know, I don't really want to get too detailed with this one before I've gotten in my other pears. So what I'm going to do next is now I need to look at the angles of this back pear. But also, as I'm doing that, I want to try and look at what's called negative space. So that's the space in between my two objects. So if I'm looking at the edge of this pear, okay, right here, and looking at how there's a lot of space right here, but it's overlapping, you know, like there's no space over here. So that means my pear is angled, but I don't want it to get so angled that I ignore how they're overlapping. So, and of course, you know, this isn't set in stone. I can always adjust things. Like right now, this angle is very severe compared to here because it's a little bit more round. So I could come in and lighten my lines a little bit and adjust that angle. But a lot of times when you find something that you need to change, I'll try and put the correct line in and then erase the line that I got wrong. Because sometimes if I'm correcting something and I erase the line that I did wrong, then sometimes I might draw that line in the same exact place I just got done fixing. And that's just human nature sometimes. So, and I'm just putting this in lightly. Okay, and then I'm going to move on to my last pair. And oops, and now that I'm double checking my space, I have too much space here. So I'm going to be moving over my pear a little bit. Doo-doo-doo. So again, be willing to change. Happens to everyone. And I'm double checking my measurements. So once you have your pears drawn out, then it's a good time to step back a little bit and look at it from afar, because sometimes if you've been working on a drawing for so long, up close it can kind of get a little overwhelming. So it's always good to take a step back. You know, it could just be holding your drawing away from you, but it always helps me. And then now that I have my pears fairly drawn out, obviously you'd want to spend a lot more time refining your drawing until, you know, you're happy enough to start on the shadows. But what I'm going to start into next is drawing out my cast shadows. So when you have an object in space and there's a light source, so could be the sun, could be a lamp, the light is normally coming in one direction. So right now it's coming from the right. So this area is my highlight. And then as my shape is turning and it's going away from the light, I'm starting to get a middle value and then a core shadow. So that's like the darkest part on my object. So all objects are going to have some sort of value unless they're in like a completely unlit room. So even my pencil right now, where it's, you know, laying on my paper, it's casting a little bit of a shadow. And that's what this is. And your cast shadow is always going to go in the opposite direction of your highlights. So I'm very lightly going to draw those out. And you always want to look at how, you know, normally they start a little bit underneath the object. And then I could fill those in with the side of my pencil. And then those shadows kind of help us see now that this pear back here is, you know, in the very back. It's far away from everything else. This one's in the very front, and then this one's kind of like in the middle. So, and that's all about, you know, looking at the space in between objects and looking at how they relate to each other. So where they're lining up with each other always helps us kind of space it out, because you won't just intuitively know. You always have to be checking and measuring and just being patient with yourself. So now that we have our cast shadows, what I want to do now is try and look for where each of my value sections are. So like I said, my core shadow, middle value, and highlight, which you might have something that's a little bit in the middle, and that's totally fine too. So what I'm going to do is just kind of very lightly draw in those shadow shapes. So this is my core shadow. And depending on the pear, since they're a different shape, you know, and they might have more of a roundness to them or be curving in a different direction, they're not going to all be exactly the same shape. So you really want to take your time and look at each of your individual pears. And then I'm going to take my lighter pencil and draw out my middle value, which is a little bit over here too. And then with each of my pencils, I'm going to be putting in my value. So like I said, the core shadow on here is going to be my darkest. So I'm just using what's called hatching, which is just kind of doing lines that are going side to side using my pencil. So I don't want to just have lines going up and down, because that's going to make it look like it's flat. And then I'm taking a little bit of a lighter pencil like my HB, and I'm overlapping those lines just a little bit and filling in my middle value, leaving my highlight, and then I'll do the same thing for each of my other pairs. So, and I'm also overlapping them just a little bit, and I can always do another coat on the really, really dark shadow if it doesn't look like it has enough contrast. And contrast is just, you know, if it looks like everything's blending in together. And then even on my stems, you also have highlight and mostly just a core shadow, so I can make it a little bit darker on one side of my stem. And then if I wanted to spend more time on it, then I could do like some more cross hatching in between lines. And then I could also fill in the background and make that really dark. But this is about the point that we want to get to. You could always, you know, do more, do less. You know, I could spend more time and fill in other values that I see in my picture. But this is just kind of a practice in, you know, how to start out a drawing and also how to find your shadow shapes. Because no matter what you're doing, if you're painting, if you're drawing, you always want to try and look for, you know, shadow shapes and how things relate to one another.